Hi, so this is the last week of remote learning with new lessons, and it is a slideshow that was actually made by Miss Jenkins. So shout out to Miss Jenkins for the slideshow this week. And the last topic is terrorism. It says here terrorism unit and America's response, but we are going to specifically look at a few accounts of terrorist attacks. Now, they could be internal terrorist attacks or from other nations, here specifically in the United States. One thing to note is that terrorist attacks happen all over the world and for various different reasons. It's not specifically one group against another group. It usually, in history, obviously happens more likely from an internal source than it does actually from an external source. In more recent history, we've seen different people from different nations attacking specific regions on the basis of religious differences, economic differences, political differences, and things like that, which, again, still historically, when we look at terrorist attacks, I mean, it doesn't matter who or what, but typically it is over those different differences. So it could be like internal, like I said, or external. So let's take a look at these notes. They're pretty cool. So here's just a few definitions because, like I said, terrorism, we often think about international terrorism where we have these different violent groups committed by individuals who are associated with a foreign terrorist organization that is state sponsored. However, we know that there's a lot of domestic terrorism that exists. They're violent acts committed by groups with different ideological goals. Like I said, a lot of times they're political, religious, social, they could be racial, they could be environmental, and groups that you may think are awesome, another group may categorize them as a terroristic group, as a terrorist group, but not because they're like necessarily killing people, but because their ideological basis is so extreme that it creates this like polarizing effect, the boycotting actions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, I'm not glorifying any terrorism here. I'm just saying that terrorist activity comes from everywhere. And, you know, a lot of times people are swayed by specific ideology and that hate, that hate talk that's drummed up from this. And sorry, definition of terrorism is the unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians, in the pursuit of political aims. So, to grow yourself politically, to victimize one other group. So, here's some things that happened. These are all things that happened in my lifetime, and they are all considered to be terrorist attacks. So, in Oklahoma City on April 19th, at this Alfred P. Murrah building, it's a federal building in Oklahoma City. It was blown up when a truck full of explosives was detonated. 168 people were killed and hundreds more were injured. Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nicholas were responsible. McVeigh was extremely upset with the government. He didn't like how they handled. There was an incident in Waco, Texas, involving some oil, and he really was not pleased with the response of the United States government at that. So McVeigh, who was brilliant, he was a brilliant chemist, and he decided that he was going to engineer a truck full of explosives and drive it into this building filled with innocent civilians who were government workers and just blow the building up. Now, you might be like, how does like a van full of explosives cause as much damage as pictured here? Like I said, these were specifically engineered explosives, um, not just like your general run-of-the-mill pipe bomb. Like this was a premeditated and an extremely devastating event. So it took the world by shock, it took the United States by shock. And actually, right, you can go visit this spot today at this government building in this area where the parking lot is. They have created a really nice memorial to all the people that were killed during this incident. And McVeigh, he was convicted, so was Nichols. They are found guilty. McVeigh received the death penalty, and Nichols received life in prison. And we'll talk about some controversy with the death penalty a little later on. I know some of us in our class have talked about it, but other classes may not have. So you might remember this happening, but this is the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida. So on June 12th, 2016, Omar Mateen went into the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida, and shot, killing a crowd of 49 people. Um, it's unclear whether or not the crime was linked to ISIS. The man who committed the crime pledged his allegiance to ISIS that night, or whether or not this is considered a hate crime because Pulse was a gay nightclub and he, had his own bias. But either way, this event was incredibly devastating. These people are just looking to express their individuality and have a good night with friends. And somebody went in there and then made it, a very traumatic and devastating event. So America's response was that police stormed through the building as this was happening because people were calling and texting, and they killed Mateen. So, there was speculation as to whether or not his widow knew what was going on, that he had pledged allegiance to ISIS, that he had this hatred for homosexuals. But either way, still an incredibly devastating example of terrorism in the United States. This one, I'm sure you all know. So on September 11th, 2001, 19 Muslim terrorists hijacked 4 planes and flew them into the Twin Towers. So these are the World Trade Center towers in New York City. And these were, at the time, the very tallest buildings in New York City. And they were representative of American power. They were representative of capitalism. So they're not just like 2 tall buildings. They also had a lot of meaning about them. They were a huge piece of the New York City skyline. And other targets were the Pentagon, which is obviously like the military brain of Washington, D.C. And there was another plane that crashed in a field in Pennsylvania. But about 3,000 people were killed on 9/11. Osama bin Laden and the terrorist group Al Qaeda were responsible for the terrorist attack. And the planes had left from Boston, and after this, the United States is going to really ramp up security. Obviously, this is going to start a war in the Middle East, specifically with Afghanistan, which is where Osama bin Laden was said to be hiding out. But this is a huge day in American history. A lot of us adults remember it as being a really scary, defining moment. Obviously, there's been several of those as it feels in the last few years, but something that we still talk about today. So, in response to 9/11, it dispatched Operation Enduring Freedom to break up the Taliban regime in Afghanistan and destroy bin Laden's terrorist network. Osama bin Laden was killed 10 years later during that raid that was carried out, SEAL Team 6. The Department of Homeland Security was created to help prevent terrorist attacks such as these. The United States Patriot Act was established, which actually is a throwback to, Alien and Sedition Acts and things that, they borderline seem unconstitutional, however, with past precedent, are able to be established. And the Patriot Act gives permission to expand surveillance and of not just suspected terrorists, but also of American citizens. And the Bush Doctrine was established, which, you're either with America or you're with the terrorists, which is an ideology that has obviously been around for quite a while. I mean, think about the Cold War. You're either with capitalists or you're with communists. So we're still living through this. Operation Enduring Freedom, the war on terror, as we call it, is still happening right now. We still have troops in Afghanistan, and later more troops were moved into Iraq. We have soldiers who are still dying over there over this event. So it's not over. Again, you guys may remember this too. It seems like just yesterday to me, but looking back now, 7 years ago. So on April 15th, 2013, at the 2013 Boston Marathon, two bombs exploded near the finish line, killing spectators, injuring hundreds. A police officer was shot later in the event. Tamerlan Znarev and his brother Dokar were responsible. It is believed that the Zebnaras were not connected to a terrorist group and actually carried this out on their own. And they believe that their anger stemmed from American supports of the Soviets in the Chechen wars with Russia. Their father was from Chechnya and escaped during the war, and the United States was like pro-Russia in their policy by taking over Chechnya. And there's more. So you guys might remember that there was a manhunt for the brothers. Tamerlan, the older brother, was killed by gunfire in Watertown by police. Dokar was captured and found guilty. He received the death penalty. He is still on death row, awaiting, I guess he's trying to have another hearing. And after the Boston Marathon bombing, new laws were established limiting the size of bags carried to venues. Some venues require see-through bags. Like if you go to a concert, sometimes they require that if you have a purse or something, it has to be see-through, like you work at Six Flags. But one thing to know is, so I was going to talk briefly about the death penalty. A lot of these people who are convicted end up getting the death penalty, and you think that might be a victory. It's very controversial. However, what happens is when you put somebody on death penalty, they are often they have an opportunity to have their trial heard again, because anyone who's on death penalty has an opportunity, not necessarily at parole, but about trying to move their trial from death penalty to life in prison. So what ends up happening is these families that experience these horrific events, like those at the Oklahoma City bombing and here at the Boston Marathon bombing, they have a trial and they live through the events. They have the images brought back. They tell the story. They relive the pain. And then they hear a verdict and they take it as a success. And then a few years later, the trial happens again and they move it to a different court in different states so that the jury can be, one that may not know as much about what was going on. And it happens all over again. And typically, people who are given the death penalty sit on death row for in excess of 30 years. So that means that that trial might come back up again 10 more times. And this may happen again and again and again. So some families actually choose to have the person who is found guilty actually with life in prison without the opportunity for parole because they don't have a chance to bring their case to trial again. And it kind of provides like peace in a sense. Um, you know, I personally don't know what I would do if I were in that same situation, so I don't really have any feelings about that. It's really up to those who have lived through it. I like I said, I cannot even imagine. But just some things to think about today, thinking about terrorism, like it's still happening. Like I said, a lot of these things that we've talked about in these last few weeks, genocide, we've talked about different issues within Africa, social issues. We've talked about impacts from the Cold War. And it's kind of like that Billy Joel song, we didn't start the fire, but it's always burning since the world's been turning. And history is just that way, continuously repeating itself. So I hope you guys have had a fine remote learning period. Hopefully, we'll be seeing your shining faces in the fall. Have a great week.